Gavin Newsom looked across the town hall stage at JD Vance and delivered the polished insult he believed would define the evening, telling roughly 9 million viewers that people leave Ohio for California because California represents the future while Ohio belongs to the past. He said it with the expensive smile, the presidential cadence, the flawless suit, and the confidence of a politician who had spent 20 years treating every camera as an ally. The gallery applauded as Newsom praised California's economy, technology, climate agenda, and supposed proof that progressive government works, while reducing Ohio to a place Americans escape. He believed he had established the frame, diminished Vance, elevated himself, and turned the exchange into another national audition. What he failed to notice was that Vance had no intention of defending Ohio with sentiment, because the weapon open in front of him was a laptop filled with numbers. Vance remained seated, looking less like a television performer than an accountant who had found a massive entry in the wrong column. The contrast was brutal. Newsom stood beneath the lights with perfect hair and practiced gestures, while Vance looked as though he were quietly preparing someone else's audit. He did not interrupt, raise his voice, or offer the emotional argument Newsom's team expected to exploit. He waited for the applause to fade, glanced at the screen, and answered in the flat voice of a man who knew charm becomes loudest when the numbers underneath it are weak. Then he introduced one number, and the California performance began losing its shine before Newsom understood that the attack had started. Newsom had claimed people were leaving Ohio for California, but Vance answered that since 2020, California had lost more than 800,000 residents through net migration. They had moved to Texas, Florida, Arizona, Nevada, and even Ohio, turning Newsom's regional insult into a speech built on an outdated version of his own state. The governor's smile remained, but his eyes stopped moving, creating the first visible separation between the confident expression and the concern underneath it. The gallery did not immediately react, yet 14 cameras captured the crack and carried it to millions of screens. The man mocking Ohio was now being asked why hundreds of thousands of people had voted against California with their feet. Vance did not stay on migration because migration was only the entrance to a larger record of warnings ignored, controls removed, money lost, and victims abandoned. He opened the next tab and moved to April 8th, 2020, when Gavin Newsom signed the executive order behind the policy called Pay Now, Verify Later. The policy suspended identity verification requirements for unemployment claims processed through California's Employment Development Department, allowing payments before identities were properly checked. On March 14th, 25 days earlier, the department's fraud prevention team had warned the governor's office that removing those requirements would create significant fraud exposure and was not recommended. The warning came first, the signature came afterward, and the room suddenly had two dates that carried more weight than every slogan Newsom had delivered. March 14th was the warning, April 8th was the order, and the 25 days between them marked the exact point where caution was discarded. Newsom could argue about politics, urgency, or intention, but he could not erase the sequence from the record. His administration was told that identity verification mattered before he authorized the policy that weakened it. The result was approximately $32.6 billion in fraudulent unemployment claims, not a technical mistake, temporary backlog, or harmless administrative embarrassment. It was a financial collapse so enormous that calling it an operational failure sounded less like an explanation than an insult to every taxpayer forced to absorb it. Roughly $20 billion of the fraudulent total involved federal CARES Act money administered by California, bringing federal obligations into a disaster the governor could no longer treat as a local inconvenience. Vance emphasized the sequence carefully. The fraud team identified the danger. The governor's office received the warning. Newsom signed the order, and the system began paying before asking basic questions. Thousands of incarcerated people received unemployment checks, including convicted murderers, convicted rapists, and death row inmates. About $1 billion went to prisoners who could not possibly have lost jobs while serving their sentences. They did not defeat a strong system. They passed through a system deliberately weakened after specialists warned the governor exactly what would happen. The room changed when Vance moved from totals to victims, because billions feel distant until they are attached to a name, a business, and a damaged life. He introduced Ray Morales, who had operated a taco shop in San Bernardino for 22 years before a criminal used his name and social security number to file a fraudulent claim. The system paid roughly $14,000 to the criminal, then told the real Ray that he had already received benefits when he later needed help. Ray spent 8 months proving he was himself, nearly lost his home, and watched his credit score fall to 580, damage that remained 6 years later. That was pay now, verify later in practice. The fraudster was paid quickly, the victim was questioned slowly, and the innocent man became the burden. Ray was one of approximately 47,000 documented identity theft victims in California's unemployment system, including teachers, nurses, employees, and small business owners whose claims were blocked after criminals stole their identities. Their credit was damaged, benefits were denied, and finances were destabilized by a policy sold as speed, but operating like organized negligence. In January 2026, 6 years after the collapse, the California State Auditor still classified the Employment Development Department as a high-risk agency because improvement remained insufficient. Newsom's hands began moving before his mouth found an answer, and one raised gesture died halfway through, looking exactly like an argument abandoned before completion. Vance then opened another tab and moved from the policies Gavin Newsom signed to the people Gavin Newsom trusted, where the record became even harder to defend. Dana Williamson, Gavin Newsom's former chief of staff, had been entrusted with the machinery of the governor's office before federal prosecutors indicted her on 23 counts involving bank fraud and wire fraud. According to the record presented by Vance, Williamson submitted approximately $1.7 million in fabricated business expenses, including luxury handbags, private charter flights, and an extravagant birthday trip to Mexico billed through public accounts. This was not a distant contractor or an obscure employee hidden inside a forgotten department, but the person Newsom had selected to operate beside him at the center of California government. The governor could dismiss one bad appointment as deception, but he could not explain why misconduct kept appearing around people granted access, authority, and taxpayer money under his supervision. A governor is measured not only by the policies carrying his signature, but also by the people he empowers and the behavior he tolerates until prosecutors intervene. Williamson was not the only name in the file, because Rodrigo Santos, another Newsom appointee, was convicted after defrauding clients of approximately $775,000. Santos altered checks by changing the name written on them so the money could be deposited into a personal account, conduct that eventually produced a 30-month prison sentence. Vance did not claim that every dishonest subordinate automatically made the governor personally guilty of every crime, because he did not need to stretch the argument that far. His point was narrower and more damaging. Newsom repeatedly placed trust in people who exploited that trust, while the systems around them failed to detect, stop, or expose the misconduct quickly. Once is an embarrassment, twice demands scrutiny, and a continuing pattern becomes evidence of leadership that celebrates control while practicing almost none. Newsom attempted to summon the dismissive smile that had carried him through press conferences, recall campaigns, and friendly editorial boards, but the gallery no longer returned it. For perhaps the first time that evening, Gavin Newsom smiled alone, and a smile without an answering audience stops functioning as confidence and begins looking like camouflage. The corners of his mouth weakened first, then the center, then the eyes, producing 4 seconds of visible collapse captured from the left by one of the television cameras. Nothing dramatic was required because the absence of his usual performance was more revealing than shouting, anger, or an open admission could have been. The mask had not been ripped away by an insult. It had been worn down by dates, indictments, appointments, and numbers that refused to applaud. Vance then did what California's agencies had avoided doing in one place. He added the major losses together. He listed approximately $32.6 billion in unemployment fraud, an estimated $146 billion in medical-related fraud, billions more connected to suspected abuse in the IHSS program, and $37 billion in homelessness spending without adequate tracking or improved outcomes. The combined figure reached roughly $215 billion under one governor, a number so large that ordinary political language became useless beside it. No agency had placed the failures into one total. No administration report had presented the entire picture, and Newsom had never stood before California taxpayers and performed the arithmetic publicly. Vance completed the addition in seconds, then asked the question Newsom's government had spent years avoiding. Where did the money go, and why could nobody provide a complete answer? The press gallery immediately understood the significance, because the revelation was not that every figure had been completely unknown, but that nobody in authority had connected them. Separate scandals can be buried in separate agencies, separate audits, separate budget years, and separate press cycles until the public loses track of the cumulative damage. Vance removed those barriers and placed the losses on one ledger, making it impossible to treat each disaster as an unrelated administrative accident. The total exposed the political usefulness of fragmentation, because $32 billion can be blamed on emergency conditions, another program can be blamed on contractors, and homelessness spending can be defended as compassionate intention. Once the figures were combined, however, compassion, urgency, and bureaucracy could no longer conceal a governing structure that spent at historic levels while repeatedly failing to track results. Vance opened another tab and turned to California's high-speed rail project, a monument to the difference between announcing a future and delivering one. California voters approved the project in 2008 with an estimated cost of approximately $33 billion, a promised route connecting Los Angeles and San Francisco, and a projected completion date of 2020. By 2026, the estimated cost had climbed beyond $128 billion, nearly 4 times the original figure, while not a single paying passenger had ridden the system. The only section under construction-connected areas around Merced and Bakersfield, far removed from the original promise used to win public approval. California had not received a functioning statewide rail network. It had received 18 years of rising costs, delayed schedules, narrowed ambitions, and speeches insisting that the failure remained visionary. When Vance joked that nobody had demanded a $128 billion train merely to reach Bakersfield, the room laughed with the exhausted relief of people drowning in enormous figures. Newsom used the laughter as an opportunity to interrupt and describe the project as a long-term infrastructure investment, believing the familiar phrase could restore control. Vance answered immediately that 18 years, $128 billion, and 0 passengers sounded less like long-term planning and more like money long gone. The laughter stopped because the joke had only created the opening, while the arithmetic supplied the blow. Everyone watching could calculate the result without an economist, consultant, or government report, and elementary math became more devastating than every sophisticated defense Newsom's advisors could construct. The final audit sequence was even simpler because Vance read the years one after another: 2021, 2022, 2023, 2024, 2025, and January 2026. In every year, the California State Auditor continued warning that the Employment Development Department remained a high-risk agency. 6 warnings across 6 years meant the governor could not claim that the problems had been hidden, newly discovered, or impossible to anticipate. The same deficiencies remained, the same institution remained vulnerable, and the same administration remained responsible for producing more statements than repairs. Newsom had been warned before the fraud, warned after the fraud, and warned repeatedly during the years when his government claimed improvement. After 6 years of warnings, the administration's most revealing response was not a structural overhaul, a complete recovery plan, or a transparent accounting of the missing money. California hired a New York public relations firm under a contract worth approximately $19 million to rehabilitate the state's brand. Taxpayer money was therefore directed toward changing how the failure looked while the underlying system remained classified as high risk. The government had billions in unrecovered fraud, approximately 187,000 homeless residents, unfinished infrastructure, and businesses carrying the financial consequences of unemployment debt. Instead of fixing the leak, Newsom's administration purchased more attractive paint for the damaged wall and expected the public to admire the color. California still owed the federal government approximately $21 billion in unemployment insurance loans, and the cost of that debt did not remain inside Sacramento. Employers faced higher federal unemployment taxes, adding hundreds of dollars per worker each year and punishing businesses that had neither designed pay now, verify later, nor approved fraudulent claims. Ray Morales therefore appeared in the record a second time because the same taco shop owner whose identity had been stolen now paid higher payroll taxes created by the system that failed him. The government allowed a criminal to take benefits under Ray's name, delayed help while Ray proved his identity, damaged his credit, and then charged his business for the debt left behind. He paid twice, first through the theft of his name, and then through the tax burden imposed to repair a fraud Gavin Newsom had been warned not to invite. 2 former Employment Development Department employees had already been indicted for giving organized crime networks access to the system from the inside, proving that California's unemployment disaster was not limited to anonymous outsiders filing fraudulent claims from distant computers. Insiders understood where the weaknesses were, knew which controls had been removed, and allegedly opened doors that should never have existed after the administration had been warned about fraud exposure. The FBI investigation was now examining the chain of command above those employees, asking who authorized access, who received internal reports, and who allowed the vulnerabilities to remain. That chain did not disappear inside a cubicle. It moved upward through supervisors, directors, deputies, senior staff, and eventually towards the governor's office where the original executive order had been signed. The question was no longer whether fraud occurred, because billions of dollars had already answered that, but how far knowledge and responsibility traveled before somebody decided protecting the system mattered less than preserving the appearance of control. In 2022, California's Attorney General said there was no evidence of executive involvement in the unemployment fraud, language that functioned as a political shield around Newsom's office. By March 2026, however, that same office no longer repeated the protection and instead said it could not comment on ongoing reviews. The distance between no evidence and cannot comment was small in word count, but enormous in meaning, because one phrase closed the door while the other admitted that the door was still being examined. Newsom's own political allies were no longer giving him the clean public denial that had protected him for years. When the Attorney General from the governor's own party stops offering certainty, the governor is not surrounded by defenders. He is surrounded by people waiting to see what investigators uncover. Vance placed the complete picture in front of Newsom without raising his voice. Roughly $215 billion in fraud waste, and spending without measurable results, 6 years of repeated auditor warnings, approximately 47,000 documented identity theft victims, and a multi-billion-dollar federal unemployment debt pushed onto employers. He added a former chief of staff facing 23 federal counts, 2 department insiders accused of opening access to criminal networks, an expanding federal investigation, and an attorney general who would no longer say the executive office had been cleared. Every component led back to the same administration that had celebrated speed, investment, compassion, innovation, and leadership while failing to protect the money or explain the outcomes. The official response to that record was a $19 million public relations contract intended to rehabilitate California's image. Vance reduced the entire system to the phrase Newsom could not escape. Instagram with a budget. The room did not immediately applaud because the line did not land like a campaign slogan designed to trigger cheers. It landed like the final sentence of an audit, compressing billions of dollars, thousands of victims, years of warnings, and one expensive public relations contract into 5 words. The audience exhaled together after sitting through a sequence of numbers that had become increasingly difficult to dismiss as separate accidents. Newsom's face changed, not into panic or rage, but into something more politically damaging, an expression that was no longer being performed for the cameras. The polished public face disappeared, leaving the look of a governor who understood that the distance between his brand and his record had just been measured in front of the country. In the press gallery, reporters stopped typing and began texting editors, producers, and assignment desks, because the next day's headline had already been supplied by the governor's own contract. The words PR firm moved across phones from different outlets at the same time, not because the journalists had coordinated, but because the contrast was impossible to ignore. California had not spent $19 million fixing unemployment verification, recovering stolen funds, completing the rail system, or developing a complete public accounting of homelessness spending. It had spent that money trying to improve the way California's failures were perceived outside California. The administration had effectively confirmed Vance's criticism by paying specialists to repair the narrative instead of demonstrating that it had repaired the government. Newsom fought back because retreat had never been part of his political vocabulary, and he had survived earlier scandals by talking faster than his critics could organize their questions. He stood, recovered his volume, and listed Project Homekey, the CARE Act, California's electric vehicle expansion, climate legislation, education spending, mental health initiatives, and housing programs. The familiar rhythm returned as he named investments, frameworks, commitments, and programs with the confidence of a man who believed quantity could substitute for proof. For 5 minutes, he filled the room with initiatives, but he did not answer where the missing money had gone, why the warnings had been ignored, or why results continued falling behind spending. Newsom added up the announcements because adding up the outcomes would have returned the conversation to Vance's ledger. Vance waited until the program list ended, then pointed out that Newsom had named 12 programs without identifying one verified result. The governor had said investment repeatedly, but had not said return, revealing the difference between spending public money and governing it responsibly. Spending meant announcing how much entered the system, while governing required knowing where it traveled, what it produced, who benefited, and whether the original problem improved. Under Newsom, the money leaked, the people leaked out of California, and public trust leaked every time another audit described the same unresolved weakness. Instead of repairing the pipe, the administration painted the wall, and the $19 million contract represented the cost of pretending a new surface could conceal structural damage. Newsom's posture settled as Vance spoke, his shoulders dropping slightly and his height seeming to shrink under 14 cameras. The physical change was small, but televised politics magnifies small movements because voters recognize hesitation before consultants can rename it. In the gallery, a California transportation employee shook her head with the recognition of someone who had watched public money disappear into systems that never seemed to improve. She was not reacting to ideology or party slogans. She was reacting to a description of government that matched what state employees and taxpayers had witnessed for years. Vance had attached numbers to a frustration California's political class had repeatedly treated as background noise. The moderator asked for closing statements, and Newsom returned to the language of California's future, resilience, innovation, and pioneering spirit. The delivery remained polished, the voice still carried the presidential tone, and every sentence sounded prepared for a national campaign advertisement. But the audience had already completed the arithmetic, and arithmetic does not become less damaging because a governor speaks confidently over it. The essential question remained where approximately $215 billion had gone, and why the administration could not provide a complete, credible accounting. Newsom could offer vision, but vision without records, controls, or results had become another expensive form of public relations. Vance gave no dramatic closing performance because the ledger had already delivered the conclusion. He closed the laptop, took a sip of water, and placed the glass down with the quiet finality of someone who had finished counting and found the account short. In the hallway, Newsom's deputy chief of staff looked at a phone showing dozens of missed calls, including a message from a major 2028 fundraising figure saying they needed to talk. In the language of political finance, those 4 words meant donors had watched the same exchange, seen the same numbers, and recognized that $215 billion could become an attack ad requiring no creativity from an opponent. Newsom left the stage faster than he had entered it, without the wave, the eye contact, or the practiced search for cameras, moving instead like a man whose only remaining objective was finding the car. What followed was not a debate recap, not a temporary media cycle, and not another evening of partisan clips that vanished once the next outrage arrived. 3 moments from the town hall spread across the country and collected tens of millions of views within 72 hours, each one exposing a different layer of the same failure. The first showed pay now, verify later, the March 14th warning, the April 8th order, and the billions that flowed through a system stripped of basic identity verification. The second carried Vance's phrase, Instagram with a budget, across taxpayer groups, business forums, political pages, and professional circles where the line was treated as both mockery and diagnosis. The third required no narration at all, only 4 seconds of Gavin Newsom smiling alone while the room refused to smile back. The clip about unemployment fraud traveled through communities that understood the damage personally because they had spent months proving identities stolen by criminals and mishandled by the state. Ray Morales was no longer an isolated business owner buried in an agency file. He became the recognizable face of a system that paid imposters quickly and treated victims like suspects. The silent clip of Newsom's fading smile spread even faster because viewers did not need policy expertise to understand what had happened. They saw a practiced political expression remain on the surface after confidence had already disappeared underneath it. 4 seconds did what 20 years of opposition messaging had failed to do. It made the performance visible as a performance. During the first week, the United States Department of Labor Inspector General announced a formal investigation into California's handling of approximately $20 billion in Federal CARES Act unemployment funds. Investigators would examine the April 8th executive order, the March 14 warning memorandum, and the internal chain of decisions that suspended identity verification despite explicit warnings about fraud exposure. The announcement did not need to accuse Newsom publicly because the order already carried his signature and the timeline already established what his office had been told. A policy once defended as emergency efficiency was now being reviewed as the possible opening through which billions of federal dollars disappeared. Newsom could no longer control the frame by calling the losses unfortunate, unprecedented, or unavoidable, because investigators were examining whether they had been predicted before they occurred. The House Oversight Committee then issued a subpoena to Gavin Newsom personally, demanding sworn testimony about who authorized pay now, verify later, who received the March 14th warning, and why the recommendation was overridden. That subpoena changed the risk from political embarrassment to legal exposure, because testimony under oath punishes inconsistency in ways a press conference never does. Newsom could testify and face detailed questions about documents, dates, and communications, or resist and allow every refusal to become another headline. The charm that had carried him through interviews could not rewrite a memorandum, alter a signature, or erase 25 days from the calendar. Under oath, cadence loses value, slogans lose protection, and every answer must survive contact with the record. By the second week, Democrats in the California legislature established a special select committee on pandemic fraud accountability with authority to investigate executive decisions connected to losses exceeding $30 billion. The significance was not merely procedural, because the committee came from Newsom's own party and could not be dismissed as a Republican ambush manufactured for television. After millions of people had watched the same documents and heard the same numbers, silence had become politically dangerous for lawmakers who once treated loyalty as safer than scrutiny. Newsom's allies were no longer choosing between defending him and attacking him. They were choosing between investigating him and appearing complicit in the failures surrounding him. The political shelter built over years of shared party control began opening from the inside. The Dana Williamson case also moved deeper into discovery as prosecutors sought communications between the former chief of staff and the governor's office involving procurement and spending decisions. If those records showed that senior officials had noticed irregular expenses and failed to act, the administration would face another example of warnings ignored until prosecutors arrived. The Chanel handbags, private flights, and luxury travel were not damaging merely because they sounded extravagant, but because they reinforced a larger pattern of weak supervision inside institutions claiming unmatched competence. Pay now, verify later revealed failures in policy control, while Williamson's alleged conduct raised questions about failures in personnel control. Together, they created the kind of pattern that no public relations contract could reduce to one unfortunate mistake. California's Attorney General then replaced the old assurance of no evidence of executive involvement with the phrase that he could not comment on ongoing reviews. Those words did not accuse Newsom, but they removed the shield that had protected him whenever critics asked how high responsibility reached. Political survival often depends less on enthusiastic defenders than on institutions willing to repeat a clean denial, and that denial was now gone. The governor's last dependable line of institutional protection had become procedural silence. From that moment, every subpoena, review, and document request carried more weight because nobody in authority was willing to say the governor's office had been cleared. During the third week, a class action lawsuit was filed on behalf of approximately 47,000 identity theft victims whose names had been used in fraudulent unemployment claims. The lead plaintiff was a single mother from San Diego whose identity was used to obtain roughly $22,000 before she was denied legitimate benefits and eventually lost her apartment. She and her 2 children lived in a car for 3 months while California's system insisted that money stolen under her name counted as money paid to her. Her story reached a national audience and turned administrative language into a picture no official could soften. children sleeping inside a vehicle because the state had rewarded a criminal first. Estimated damages reached billions, transforming private suffering into a financial claim large enough to threaten the same government that had failed to protect the victims. California employers then began organizing against the higher federal unemployment taxes imposed because the state had not repaid its federal debt. Small business owners understood the injustice immediately because they were being charged to repair losses created by decisions they had never approved. Restaurant owner Andrew Gruel summarized the anger by explaining that his payroll taxes had risen because the governor's system paid prisoners and criminals, leaving honest businesses to finance the recovery. The phrase, "I am the later," spread through shops, restaurants, repair garages, and payroll offices, turning pay now, verify later against the administration that created it. Business owners were the later, taxpayers were the later, identity theft victims were the later, and the governor's promise of speed had become their permanent bill. The FBI confirmed that its inquiry into former Employment Development Department employees had expanded to additional levels of the administrative chain. That language was restrained, but the direction was obvious. Employees led to supervisors, supervisors led to directors, directors led to deputies, and deputies led toward the governor's senior staff. Every level added another opportunity for someone to have seen the warnings, received the reports, or understood that organized networks were exploiting access from inside the system. The investigation was no longer contained at the bottom where administrations prefer to place blame. It was moving upward toward the offices that claimed authority when California succeeded and suddenly claimed distance when California failed. By the second month, Newsom's approval rating had fallen from 52% to 33%, dropping below the level that had preceded the 2021 recall effort. A new recall petition gathered signatures at several times the earlier pace, showing that the town hall had not created dissatisfaction from nothing, but had given existing dissatisfaction a single number and a single image. Major donors requested private briefings on the $215 billion total because contributors do not invest in explanations they cannot defend in public. A senior advisor who had worked with Newsom for 15 years resigned, while reports from inside the political operation described the combined figure as indefensible. The PR contract intended to protect the brand had instead confirmed that the brand required protection from the record. By the third month, the Sacramento Bee, the Los Angeles Times, and the San Francisco Chronicle all published editorials questioning whether Newsom could continue governing effectively. Their language remained polite, measured, and institutional, but the meaning beneath it was unmistakable. When three major hometown editorial boards separately begin asking whether a governor can finish his term, the conversation has already moved beyond presidential ambition. The question was no longer whether Gavin Newsom could reach the White House in 2028, but whether he could remain secure in Sacramento through 2026. Resignation had not become an official demand, yet it had entered the political atmosphere and begun applying pressure that no speech could remove. Newsom had not resigned, but the distance between had not and would not was shrinking with every subpoena, signature, donor call, and investigation. Meanwhile, Ray Morales continued opening his taco shop in San Bernardino at 5 in the morning, carrying a damaged credit score and higher payroll taxes 6 years after California paid a criminal using his identity. The governor remained in Sacramento, the public relations firm remained in New York, and the agency remained classified as high risk while the people harmed by it continued paying the cost. Money had leaked, residents had leaked out of the state, trust had leaked out of the government, and $19 million had been spent trying to improve the appearance of the wall. Every plumber understands what Gavin Newsom's administration refused to admit. Paint does not repair a broken pipe, And after 6 years, approximately 215,047,000 victims, federal investigations, and a collapsing political future, the pipe was still broken,